first of all, I'm going to kick off, Simon, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows about your huge heritage of programme making. We're going to talk in particular about Obstock. So 30 years or so of Obstock making.
That is a really painful way of putting it.
I'm dreading what you think about my background now. Please don't comment on my background. But what would you say, 30 years of experience, what would you say you really learned about gaining access? What are your top tips on gaining access? And what have you learned about that all-important, critical first approach?
So the most important thing is, well, to keep your eyes open, like in any program making. You've got to keep your eyes out open, and you've got to look for areas and places, institutions, people who want to tell a story. And that just means really focusing on why they might want to tell a story and what that story is. So what I do is I just kind of, as I'm sort of thinking about what might be useful, you're thinking about what the channels and what the audience might want, and you're also thinking those institutions, those people, why are they going to want to expose themselves in the unique way that observational filmmaking does. And then once you've worked out that they're a target, that they might want to tell you something, you've got to then work out both what you want to say about it and whether or not what they want to say is reconcilable with making something that is both interesting and important and worthwhile, and all the usual things that are involved in program making. So essentially, you're just looking for organisations in particular who might be going through a bit of change, who might have a new leader, might have something going on in the real world, who want to expose themselves through transparency. Because we all know that being transparent is a really, really difficult thing to do, and only the most sort of confident leaders will allow it, or individuals, if you're talking about sort of individual filmmaking. So it's about sort of listening and then going to them and then explaining why you understand what they're trying to do, but making sure you're not just giving them a PR opportunity. You're actually sort of saying, actually, there's an important story to be told here.
And talking about PR, because we have had some Obstocks in recent years, not made by you, that do end up a bit of a PR exercise. How do you explain to someone that there will be some tough stuff and they're going to have to face up to the tough stuff? How are you honest about that bit?
Well, I think it has to be like one of the first conversations you have. But I think there's ways of expressing that, so the sort of slightly pompous way is sort of saying you won't have any editorial control and the broadcasters will have editorial control and we'll do that. The actual way I do it 9 times out of 10 in the room is just say, look, it's about authenticity. If you've really got a story to tell, then it has to be authentic. You need to trust us, but you need to be real. And in that process, there will be enormous numbers of wince moments, I call them. I always say, look, there will be points when you're watching this program and you're thinking, I wish that person hadn't done it in that particular way. But trust us, that the public will believe that much, much more if that's real. If you try and take those out, then they'll know, and they'll know it's sanitized. They'll know it's PR. So essentially, you're controlling the conversation from very early on, which is this is an expectation of what you should have for doing this. You might get something from it, can't guarantee it, but there will, along the road, there'll be some bumps.
Okay, a question's just come in. Somebody said, in your experience, is it better to make a first approach on an email or a phone call or in person? How do you actually make that very, very first approach?
I think nearly always in life you want to go as close to the top as you can go, because if you can get a real conversation going early, then you've got a shared understanding of what it might be. But obviously in the modern world, if you're talking about institutions, you end up going through PR departments to through press officers and the rest. So there, what you've got to hope for is that you've got someone who understands what you're doing, so you've got to slightly tell them what you've done before and say, and this is what I've spotted something about you that I think you should put on television. I always think it's a bit like the way in which recruitment works, which is if someone comes to me and says, I want to work with you, or can we work together, or what do you look for? I kind of think, have they spotted what I do? Have they really thought about the stuff I've done previously, and do they understand it, and are they interested in it? And I think an institution or a PR department or a boss, any of those people will be able to quickly smell whether or not you're genuinely interested, or whether you're just doing the rounds, you're just passing around going, anyone got some access? And you're very unlikely to have interesting access if you do it that way. So it's kind of a really intense focus on what that person that you're targeted for it to access is trying to say, and what they're really doing, and a real understanding of that. And then you walk into a meeting and you instantly, you know that everyone's on the same page. And that you immediately know the kind of the whole chemistry of the room will change when people can see you understand where they're coming from.
And when you've got the access, it's a really thin line, isn't it, between becoming too friendly, too chummy, or too remote. How do you tread that thin line? Where's the professional line for you?
Well, it's partly being really clear about what that line is from early on. I mean, and again, some of the things that are easy to do, particularly when you're working with like the BBC or Channel 4, where they understand that the reason it's going to be commissioned is obviously to say something interesting and to get you to interesting stories, but also out of a sort of bit of public service broadcasting. You can say, look, this is the way it works, guys. There isn't editorial control. We have editorial control, the broadcasters have editorial control, and we're working within, you know, pretty regulated world of Ofcom and all those sort of things and the legal constraints. So effectively, you're sort of saying, look, we all want to work together, but this is the scenario in which we're all working. As long as you understand that, you'll know where we're coming from. So I think it's partly just introducing that fairly early on into the chat.
And there's another really good question that's come in from the floor. How do you deal with organisations that say yes, let you in, and then once you've come in, they either try to control the narrative or they have a change of mind and they start trying to freeze you out?
That's really tricky. You should pray you don't get in that situation. I mean, if normally you know when that's happening, you can smell it, you can tell that it's not genuine, the offer of access, that you know that there are. I mean, it's nearly always that there'll be someone in the organisation who's resistant to that or has that view. So I think nearly always the warning signs start flashing quite early, but obviously sometimes shit happens. But it's amazing how often when shit happens, if you've built those relationships and you've built that trust, you can actually carry on doing it. And there are lots of recent examples of that. There was the BBC series a few years ago, Iceland, where the horse meat scandal hit midway through. Well, because they built those relationships, they were able to make programs which dealt with what would have been a complete calamity for Iceland in another world. I mean, closer to home with 24 hours in police custody, one of the things that I constantly talk about is the strength of relationship we built with Bedfordshire Police. And when we started filming A Corrupt Officer, I was able to talk to the chief constable and essentially throw back at him the argument for transparency, which is, you've always said it's important to have transparency. You've always said you don't have editorial control. You've always trusted us. Let's do this. Don't shut the door. And there was a wobble, but fortunately it was a wobble that only lasted a couple of hours. And then they let us in. So, you know, if you've built those relationships in advance, then you can normally deal with it. But if they are determined to close you down, you're closed down. So often when we're negotiating contracts, people endlessly worry about how a contract might be ended. You know, what are the terms under which access might be withdrawn? The truth is, if someone wants to withdraw access, they'll withdraw access. So no amount of kind of technical protection from an access agreement is really going to do it. If people don't want to let you into their lives and expose themselves in the way that we ask, you know, particularly in the modern way, because they're giving away so much. If they close you down, they're going to close you down. There's nothing you can do. You can't hold someone to a contract on that. So it's about human relations, working out again what the issue is, negotiating, and making people, you know, understand that their fear is probably unnecessary. You know, we can always delay how long a program is going to go on, or work around genuine, you know, if you talk about the present sort of corona world, you know, you can say there are ways in which we can film you which are not going to get in the way of your work. You do not need to throw us out at this particular moment. But, you know, whether that works is a different matter, but there are ways of having those conversations.
What's been the hardest pitch you've had, and how did you land it in the end?
God, I think, what are the hardest pitches? I mean, we've got cameras into some pretty bloody extraordinary places over the years. I mean, the one that comes to mind is when we did the Iraq War, where you know, there was already quite good access that a brilliant guy called Roger Courtier at the BBC had essentially sort of nurtured over many years. And Neil Grant, who I was working with at the time, had fantastic relations with the MOD. But when that second Iraq War began, we were able to go in and say, we want to tell the story from the inside of that by embedding. And we ended up getting not only onto the ground, but also into the kind of top secret control centres. That was a pretty difficult one to negotiate with, because obviously you're talking about life, death, and international security. So yeah, I mean, you can get anywhere, actually, I think, is the truth.
Yeah, there's another good question come from the floor. How do you stop people acting up for the camera and behaving unnaturally?
You stop filming them if they're doing that all the time. There's just no point in doing that. I mean, obviously, different programs, different types of documentaries, have a different type of relationship between the participant and the observer. So some actually kind of thrive on that ability for people to turn and recognize the director, or recognize where they're at, or recognize that what they're doing. And obviously, sometimes when you're doing pure observational stuff, you use those tactics, but you cut those bits out, and in order to get a sense of what's really happening, as opposed to people engaging with the camera. But I've always thought that the people who most want to be on camera are probably the people you least want to have on camera. So it's partly a question of sort of educating them by filming with them. And, people respond. People are incredibly intuitive about what you're interested in. So if your camera is rolling and you're effectively tuning out because they're showing off, then they will start spotting that. All but the most narcissistic and idiotic people will recognize that. And so I think it's a question of sort of slightly educating them in what is working, and also not going for the most obvious TV characters, because the TV characters are not really taking you into the reality of what they're doing. They're focusing on the fact that your camera's there. And actually, I just believe that there's something about, particularly with a lot of the stuff I do, which is sort of, people are doing hard jobs. They're doing genuinely bloody difficult things, nicking people, fighting wars, treating people who are really, really ill. At the end of the day, they end up focusing on the work they're doing because they're deeply professional and they really care about it and they're really invested in it. And the camera becomes almost the least important part of the room. So, I mean, obviously you can say that. It's easy for me to say that, and it's much harder when you're in the room with people. But I do think the reality is, if you do it in the right way, and if you find the right way of not becoming the story, of the you with the camera being the story, then people will calm down and they'll start behaving as they really are. And then it's a question of, as a filmmaker, working out whose story do you want to tell, who is someone who actually lights up the screen, who has an ability to communicate, who shows real emotion, that is genuinely engaging with something, and who's not that person.
And in a really crowded market of blues and twos and those types of shows, how do you stand out? What takes a good Obstock series to an exceptional Obstock series?
Quality of the access in the first instance. If you're really getting the good access, then it's hard to fuck it up. Asking the right questions, kind of what are you trying to achieve? What are you really trying to show? And that's about really thinking through the proposition. That's not about the sales proposition. It's not what you're saying to the commissioners or to the channels when you're trying to get it bought. It's really trying to work out, what are we trying to do with this? What are we trying to show? If you do that, I think that you're a long way towards sort of making that work. Those are the main things. I mean, the other thing is, obviously, you get the best people to do it. There are lots and lots of absolutely brilliant program makers, and if you can assemble them, then you're going to it's a bloody easy job to make them good. But I think constantly getting the right people, constantly engaging with the subject, and constantly just sort of thinking, what's the reality of what we're doing? And sometimes you're just hit by a blinding insight. It's slightly sort of blow my own trumpet type story, but I'll tell you the story about how sort of ambulance became what it was. So, there's been a long history of making programs about the ambulance service. I'd done 999 What's Your Emergency? I'd done various things around that. There'd been a really brilliant cutting edge film about the ambulance service, about 7 Minutes to Disaster. And when that bit of access came along, Mark Raphael, who was then at Dragonfly, sort of rang me up and said, "Do you fancy doing this?" And I said, "Look, to be honest, I'm not that interested. I don't think there's much more to say about it." And he said, "Oh, do me a favour, just go along, just give me a couple of days, just have a little think about it. You might see something." So I went along to the ambulance control centre in London, And I just was watching, and I just suddenly thought, my God, I really can see these people making genuine choices. And that's what's so difficult about the ambulance service. I'm watching as someone is choosing between whether they go and send to a child or to an old person. And that expresses the problem of resources at the moment, that they are having to make those real choices. If we can put that on the screen, then that will suddenly give a dynamism to what might be really obvious access on the trucks or in the control room. If you bring the two together, if you demonstrate that people on the ground are being controlled by this mind in control, then that might be really interesting. And then everything from that flow, so all the kind of things that you see in ambulance now, the maps and the graphics and the way in which it's done. But it was just that sort of, just a moment where I just thought, shit, that will be really compelling. That's worth doing. So I then rang to Mark up and said, look, let's try and do it this way. And then it worked.
While we're just talking about ambulance, because it's a fabulous series, it's moved to different locations. Something that people might not know is it reaches that elusive young audience, doesn't it? It really does hit with that young audience. Why do you think that is? What is it particularly about ambulance that hits the young?
It's lots of things. It's really well made. It has a gloss about it. It has a sort of sense of scale, purpose, bigness that means that it feels compelling. I think young people in particular love being taken along for a ride. They expect high production values if they're going to devote it to sort of documentaries on telly as opposed to social media type stuff. So it's because it's done in a kind of big grand way, but it keeps you in the moment. It just absolutely means if the good programs make you join them and you believe you've lived that shift. So I think that's one very compelling in terms of storytelling for everyone, but I think it particularly appeals to young people. I think it's also a sort of slightly opposite of the way most people think about it, which is a lot of programming that is sort of designed for young people is only structured around, we can only really have young people in it. The truth is, if you can find compelling ways of telling stories about the world, then people will engage with it. So actually what we found is that young people love the stories of the 100-year-old grannies with sort of heightened sexual appetites much more than middle-aged people. So the truth is, it just genuinely appeals. It's both emotional, it's funny, it's sad, it's tragic, it's exciting. It does all of those things, and it throws it all together. And it also, in a bite-sized world, it gives you lots of small bite-sized stories. So as well as there being a story of a shift, which is the sort of thing I always talk about, that's what it has to have. It's not. I don't want it to be a theme. I want it to tell a story of that day, why it was particularly intense. It also gives you some really quite profound and compelling sort of little mini stories that are as long as they should be. And I think young people have got really good at spotting when material is stretched. So what Ambulance did, and it was an accident that we sort of discovered this, is that you could run stories for as long as they should last. So you can run a story for sort of 12 minutes. If you're in the middle of the most amazing, enormous, tragic car accident, you can tell that over 20 minutes. Or you can just tell actually the essence of a story in just a minute and a half if it's some incredibly sweet old lady. I'm getting my coffee. Anyone else? Sorry, that's an extremely long answer, but it's a number of things.
How much time as an exec are you spending checking in with the crews and the teams on the floor? And how much are you checking in with the institution you've got the access with? What's the balance there when you're on the go?
Completely depends on the project. I mean, some projects require a much more sort of bespoke, smaller teams where we're engaging all the time, and others are different. I mean, one of the things that I worry about with the scale of the sort of modern day documentary stuff is, one, because we can all communicate, and because it's really helpful to communicate, is the communication overload that everyone's suffering. So one of my fellow execs on police custody, she in her moments of despair, Flavia says to me, Flavia Taylor, she says, we can't make an entire series by text. But what she really means is that the WhatsApp culture is absolutely quite oppressive. It starts at 7, before 7 in the morning, and often goes on to beyond midnight. And the whole team are caught up in that, because if you're trying to follow the narrative of a particular investigation or what's going on out there, then it's hard for people not to be tuned in. And I do worry about that, the impact that hyper communication is having. But it is also why these things are great. So the fact that people have WhatsApp systems or Slack systems or have an ability to communicate with each other on an instant basis is massively helping making the decision making in the right place. So at the point where you realise you've got a problem with the institution, you know it pretty quick, and you can then jump on it quickly rather than waiting for the letter to come in or for the rage to start boiling. So it's a sort of paradox of the modern sort of communication world, which we can do it, but it actually imposes an additional burden. The thing I think everyone has to be really careful with is don't communicate for the sake of communicating. And I fall into this, which I sort of think once I've communicated, it's done. And actually, the truth is, every single communication should lead to some sort of action. It's not just a question of having done it. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've believed that we've filmed something that just because like someone's told me that it was happening. You know, there's a massive distinction between was the camera rolling, have you captured it, you know, was the rig running, is it on GoPro, and you know, just information. So the information informs the editorial decisions, but people have got to be really careful that we keep filming.
And let's go on to general docs now. There's another question from the floor that says, what obs docs that you haven't made have you wished you'd made, and you've been impressed with the way they've told the story? Which other docs?
Everyone that's won a BAFTA.
Huh?
Everyone that's won a BAFTA.
But which ones do you text your mates and go, okay, Gov, I'll give you that one?
Anything is just utterly extraordinary. Anything where your eyes are open, and you know, if I'm saying to myself, the best ones are the ones where you don't even notice you're watching them. You know, you just think, "Fuck me, this is good," and you don't want to switch it off. The next level are the ones where you just think, "God, how did they get that story? How did they persuade that?" So you know that they've kind of hit. And then the next level of it are the ones which have gone beyond simply capturing a story and aesthetically or editorially have framed it in the right way. So, you know, once you start seeing really proper craft, when you see proper questions being asked, when you see, you know, beautiful photography, when you see the fact that, you know, it's bringing something together in a sort of profound and more organized way, that's the point where you think, God, it's just a pleasure. And that's where proper filmmaking comes in. So, I mean, you know, it happens reasonably often, and it's really fantastic when you do that. And then I'm just a viewer.
There's another question from the floor that says, in terms of storytelling, do you begin with a single question you want answered, or do you prefer to capture the footage and find the story in the edit?
I think unless you've got a pretty coherent set of questions at the beginning, you're going to get lost in the amount of material. It's so easy to capture so much material now, you know, whether it's as a DV director or on a rig or, you know, with a big team. But as ever in life, you change the question, change what you're after according to the facts. So it's about having really heightened instincts about what's coming back to you. So focus initially on the question you think is interesting, but then be completely open to the change that you're seeing. And that's about understanding the material, processing the material at the right time, really listening, all the things that make brilliant program makers and directors and producers. Just keep applying them, you know, and then what will happen is you'll be telling a real story, and then it will be really compelling. So I think it's sort of don't get stuck on the initial question, and if you feel that, you know, no one's listening and that, you know, you've just got to keep shouting, and it's the job of the execs in particular to be communicating that to the channel. You know, if the story on the ground is different from what was originally commissioned, then a sensible commissioner is going to want that because it's going to be a million times better.
Yeah. And just going back to the development phase now, there's another good question from the floor that says, often commissioners will only engage if you've got the access and it's definite. So when you're talking to organisations, what's that fine balance between getting the access agreed and knowing you've got commissioner interest? Which way around do you go?
It's hard, really hard, I think, because you know, partly because people are so bloody good now, they can do a sizzle, they can do some observational filming, they can put it all together, and they can sort of package it up really well in a way that will win a commission. But often, in order to do that, you've burnt a lot of the relationships that you want to build in a slower, more considered way to do that. And you might even have conceded stuff that you wouldn't conceded normally, you know, because you've realised how vital it is to get that amazing character on, or that particular action on a tape. And you've not, and when it comes to it, they go, well, why can't we do it where you did it before? And you're thinking, no, I did it that way because I was just trying to do it really fast, and I knew it wasn't going to go on air. So I think that is increasingly a problem. You know, like a lot of these things, you know, the good commissioners are able to see beyond that, but quite often those good commissioners have then got to take it further up the line to get the commissions. So it's an enduring problem.
Yeah.
But I think don't compromise too much with your access in order to get the commission, because you'll only spend. I mean, there's nothing worse than having a shit bit of access with a badly negotiated, poor set of questions at the beginning, and then you're going to spend the next. No television, no documentary making is easy. That's the thing that people have just got to remember. Whatever level it's pitched at, it's all bloody hard. And so don't burden yourself in advance with stuff that is going to just haunt you for the next, 6 weeks, 6 months, or 6 years of your life. Because, I mean, at its worst, if you get it wrong, then it's going to hurt you. It's going to hurt your contributors. It's going to hurt that institution, and you might even be sort of, in the worst possible world, be sort of being dragged through courts and Ofcoms and all that sort of crap. So,
There's another good question from the floor. How do you balance telling the story you want to tell if a key contributor withdraws consent or starts having a serious wobble? Once it's all been filmed, how do you balance that morally in your head?
Well, I try not to do anything I think is immoral. So, I mean, that's the first. And I also try and genuinely to hear the team. So it's easier when you're closer to the sort of the need to deliver, or what the channel wants, or what the organisation wants, is to close your ears to the real kind of human story on the ground, the real ethical dilemmas and the real morality. But I'd like to think that I put quite a sort of strict, kind of like moment where I kind of think seriously about it. And am I thinking, is the reason I want to put this person on because I know it will make a much better program, or if they pull out tomorrow, is it going to screw that episode? I mean, obviously I'm thinking those things. You wouldn't be human if you wouldn't be professional if you weren't trying to do that. But equally, you have to be thinking about it as a human being. And again, if you get it wrong, then you're never going to forget that. Every program you make makes a mark on you. Every sort of relationship you have in program making makes a mark on you. And so you have to kind of think, is this the right thing? But be open about it. The thing that I fear most is when I see people looking unhappy and feeling unhappy about the situation they're in, and not having a way of sort of talking about it. And that does require a sort of trust in the team and a trust with your senior colleagues. But it's really, really important. And if you think that's not happening, then you've got to find some way of doing that, because don't sit on it. You shouldn't be feeling that unhappiness, and the team should own that moral responsibility. Sometimes in life it's not going to work out, and it's going to be difficult. But I think it's really important that that you don't carry that burden yourself in that, because it is a burden. And the more you're telling programs about important real life things, the more you're going to be dealing with the cutting edge of those difficulties every day.
There's another question here from Elliot that says, how do you balance the need for impartiality with the access, especially if you've got multiple players, so you've got lots of different players granting you access for different reasons? How do you keep that impartiality?
Well, it's partly it's going back to the boring thing of where you're starting from. You're not doing it as a piece of PR for any one of those individuals or groups. You're doing it because there is a story to be told, and someone has said, we want you to tell that story. I think if you can hold on to the idea that, in British documentary making, there is a duty of impartiality, that you shouldn't be being party pre, you should be trying to get to the truth, and that you have a duty both to this big notion of the truth and the more narrow question of kind of what's right and fair in broadcasting, then you're probably going to be all right, because you can use that against those people who are trying to get away with stuff that they shouldn't get away with. And sometimes it is going to go wrong. I mean, there have been lots of documentaries where antisocial behaviour has been shown and there have been consequences to it, but it can have very long-term consequences. I mean, famously there was a brilliant BBC series about the cops in Liverpool, Mersey Blues, many years ago, and effectively they demonstrated that that there was a lot of police corruption going on. Well, the reality of that was the programs did go out, but then access to Merseyside police has been constrained almost to now. I mean, Bernard Hogan-Howe, who was the Met Police Commissioner from Liverpool, went to the Met. He was still, he'd been a relatively junior cop at the time, he was still refusing access to the Met then. And so the people who got the access to the Met for the BBC did a really good job of sort of finally winning him over and saying it's not going to be like that again. So these things can last 20 years.
People of Liverpool, don't forget.
No, thank God.
Thank God. So look, you've clearly got a nose for a story. You've got a nose for a story. How do you help your newer, younger teams? How do you help them develop a nose for a story?
You can't give someone a nose for a story. They either have it. I mean, I'd like to think that whatever sort of program making you're doing, you've come into it because you want to tell a story. That doesn't mean you have to be sort of fiercely journalistic. It just means you've got to have an appetite to understand what's going on. So you can't do it. Just like I always say, you can't make people moral. You can't give people a moral compass. They either have a moral compass or they don't have a moral compass. So for all the training modules and editorial policy advice, you can give people guidance, but you can't actually make them moral. You have to kind of depend on that. But you need to sharpen you need to keep your story antennae sharp all the time. You need to sort of pull back sometimes and really look at it, and you have to kind of imagine. I mean, do mental exercises and going, what am I capturing here? What would be the story if I was trying to write this in a different way? If I was trying to write this as a newspaper article, if I was writing a book, those are really helpful ways of just sort of thinking, I see I'm really seeing what's in front of me, and I'm not just blinded by the quality of the access or the fact that I'm sort of got a set of relationships with people. So it's about a sort of, you're an author. When you're making a program, you're an author. You've got to consider your work. You've got to think carefully about what you're doing all the time, and you need the space to do that. So again, a lot of people work incredibly hard, and they just feel that sense that they just can't take any more on. But that that do that. Then there's also just keep your eyes out, look around. Don't just focus on the one thing. Try and develop sort of eyes in the back of your head, and that means everything from scouring social media, newspapers, what's happening in the world, kind of what's happening in the room next door when you're filming in that in one room, what's happening in the room next door. Just keep focusing on all those things, and then talk about it. There's no shame in sort of saying, what's going on here, and talking either to your senior team or to your colleagues about what the story is.
So taking up your point that you're an author, again, what's the balance between following the action and directing the action?
Well, I think in the way I make programs, there's the way I want to make programs is there's a lot of direction in that, because you're trying to organize the material, and that's what direction is. You're trying to organize it. You're trying to construct a narrative. Those are the programs I most enjoy doing, but a narrative and an argument often. And so you are directing. You have to acknowledge that. People who think it's just I've just sort of recorded unmediated are going to get completely lost, and they're going to make something really uninteresting. So you've got to acknowledge the fact that we're directing action, that we're trying to do it. But there's a difference between changing what those people are doing and bringing it out. So it's hard to explain, and we could do whole masterclasses on it. But I think a lot of people need to think more about how they produce stuff. So there are some things that happen which can't be filmed. I'll give you a good example. Jessie Versluis always comes up with. She was filming she's filming Katie Piper when her court case was happening. Katie Piper was the woman who had acid thrown in her face. And they couldn't get access to the court to film the court case. They therefore wouldn't get the moment when Katie realised that her attacker was going to prison. So Jessie just spent an enormous amount of time making sure that moment happened in a room next door to the courtroom. So she produced the hell out of it. No one was allowed to speak to each other post the conclusion of the court case until they were all in the room together. So Mum, Katie, the police officer, etc., etc. But she captured an amazing actuality moment. It was a real actuality moment that would have happened probably in the corridor of the courtroom. But because she produced it, because she directed it, she did something which ultimately made a brilliant film and won her an award. So that's what I see as the sort of direct, practical direction of a lot of these things. The underlying facts were all going to happen, but as a filmmaker, she really thought carefully in advance of it. How am I going to capture it? What is the real thing that's going to happen? And then what's going to make it happen in the right way?
And take another question from the floor. When you're on the series 2, 3, or 4, and people are starting to get fame and egos, how do you start to control that? How do you control the politics and the fame and the egos when a series is being on air?
Directors or the
I think this directors definitely. I think this he's referring to contribs more.
Yeah, well, they become harder to manage. There's absolutely no question about it. And sometimes it's a question of, you know, it's sensible to pull back a bit, to, you know, not go for the easy line of just going back to them. It's to you know, to make them want you a bit more rather than just simply showing off you. But it's hard. It's hard.
And in terms of contributors, do you sort of rightly front and centre now and always should be? What is best practice in terms of duty of care for you, getting them on air and aftercare as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, we do all have a duty of care. You know, if we are entering into really private, difficult spaces, then we've got to be really careful about the fact that just the act of us filming them, of being part of them, is going to affect those areas. So they're going to reveal things about themselves that they probably have never revealed to anyone, because of the way in which, you know, either because you've got a camera recording stuff in actuality that's happening now, or because they're talking to you and telling you those things, and you have a relationship that's much more like a counsellor than a friend or a relative. So you're going to learn that stuff in any case. You're going to affect people just by filming. You've then got this massive thing, which is that they're going to be exposed to the world. Their story is going to be on air. So you've got to then protect them in how you tell that story. You've got to think really carefully about the impacts on that person when their story is out there. You know, how are they going to receive it? What's it going to do to them? And then what's it going to do to them in their working environment and amongst their family and friends and all those sort of things? What impact is it going to make in the narrow world? And then you've got to make another calculation, which is what's it going to do in the kind of work, in a hyper social media world where, you know, hate campaigns can so easily set fire, where a lot of the things that sense that, yes, there's a degree of exposure immediately after you go on in a program, but actually it will diminish over time. You know, the program might not be available forever. It will go away. Well, you know, we can't guarantee that as much as we could in the past. You know, even at the boring level of, you know, kind of stuff that's ripped for the internet and appears on YouTube's endlessly. So even when you're really, really careful about something and you realise there was one moment, it is still out there. So our duty of care is getting harder and harder to manage the more we go to the deeper, more private spaces, which small cameras, which great directors, which remote cameras, all of those things are doing, and in the sort of media environment in which we all work. So it's a real issue, and it has to be considered, and it's part of the expense and the difficulty of making proper programs. And again, a lot of that isn't fully recognised, but because it's quite invisible. It's the iceberg that no one really wants to talk about. You know, that obviously, if you're a channel controller or a commissioner, you don't really want to know too much about that. The best ones do, and will probably engage with you about it, and never feel shy of giving them that, making them know that what that problem is. They're there to help you. They're not. You know, you don't want to shield them from the difficulties of that. But the reality is, most of these things is what your team and you as an individual owe to people. And that has impacts, and it has costs, and it's difficult, and it's not just, you know, the impact of, you know, the production period and then say goodbye. There are some people, the best program makers in my mind, keep those relationships going for as long as those relationships should keep going, and sometimes that's a terrible burden. You know, sometimes it's a complete pleasure. You know, there are people who, you know, two colleagues I've worked with who made some stuff with the in Afghanistan. They were offered a flyby by the regiment for their weddings, you know, as a result of those relationships that they built. But, you know, equally, some of those guys had PTSD, and so you know, they're still sending Christmas cards. They're still, you know, talking to them when their divorces come through and all those sort of things. So, you know, these duties of care are real. They're real, and they can't be sort of wished away.
And you've touched on schedule, and obviously you're dealing with lots and lots of live cases and sub judice and stuff like that. How do you manage the budget and the schedule and the team, and how do you manage the commissioners through that process when you've got a never-ending sort of tale to a story? How do you manage that?
Well, actually, I think for the two big series, you know, I've been doing the last few years, Ambulance and Police Custody, it's sort of easier in a way because they've got scale. Because we're producing quite a lot of programs, actually the reality is if you manage it well and if you think it through carefully, then the likelihood is you will be able to get something on air. Even in time of corona, there are some cases in police custody land which will resolve in some way, and so we will be able to make some programs, even though making them is going to be really hard for the next few weeks. So you can do that because we've got the scale, we've got big commissions, we can move our resources around, we can think it all through. The people I really worry for are smaller. It's harder when you're doing a single film or when you're doing a small series to do that, because you can get completely broken by it, and then what you find is that all of the things you've done, the relationships you've built, the knowledge you've built up, you don't have to put it down for 6 months, and you have to bring it up again. And 9 times out of 10, people are doing it for the love of the program, not for any financial reason, because the pot of money has been exhausted, because the commissioners aren't going to be handing you more cash to do that. So it's those are the ones that actually give me the most. I mean, all legal problems, all problems are difficult to resolve, but weirdly, the scale has been easier with those programs than it is with the smaller ones. I mean, I've got one series which might hit air this summer, which has been going on for 3.5 years now. Now, I know no one working on that has been paid from beyond the first 6 months, but everyone is still doing weekly emails and viewings and all that sort of stuff. And it's a nightmare. It's a complete nightmare. They won't go away, but you sort of commit to it and then you just do it.
Just talking about finishing off in the edit, in terms of stories, do you think you always know the stories you have before you go into the edit, or do you sometimes sort of find a diamond in the rough in the edit that you didn't know you had?
Well, I think that particularly with filming at scale, with big teams where you're capturing loads of material, 90% of the times you're finding, diamonds all the time. And so it's kind of, what's the best way of prospecting for those diamonds? How are you actually going to find them? So it's not about going with a clear idea of what that is. If you've done of what the story is, if you've done your record keeping and if you've done your thinking, then you're going to go into the edit much better prepared. But you will find stuff that will change entirely the way you want to tell that story. Both in terms of, one of the things I do is I sort of try and imagine what's the real story that we're telling here, and then what's the best way of telling that story. And I do think they're two sort of distinct things. And I often find that I have a pretty clear idea of what I think the story is, but I haven't, because I haven't necessarily been there all the time. You can't be across everything that happens. I'll see stuff that makes me think, oh, well, we can find a way of telling that story in a more interesting way. So that's what I'm looking for when I go into the edits at first. And I think that's a useful sort of technique to apply, because storytelling is the most important thing about what we're doing. And you've got to find a compelling way of doing that. And that means leaving some things out sometimes and then introducing them later, structuring the storytelling. Great storytellers structure their storytelling. They always have, from the very first moment that man gathered around a campfire and started telling ghost stories to each other. They structured their stories, and that's what you find when you go into the edit, ways of structuring the story. And then, if you've got compelling material, then it will blow your socks off when you see that.
And let's talk about future of documentary and where we're going. A question from the floor: what kind of stories do you think still need to be told, especially in light of Verona crisis?
Wouldn't it be lovely to be a fly on the wall of number 10 and the chief medical officer's isolation unit at the moment? My God, I can't do that. I mean, partly because the question. I mean, Donna and I, just before we came on, were chatting about this. I find myself genuinely not knowing. I just can't figure out, are they the most inexperienced and incompetent and politically sort of a dangerous bunch of people, or are they genuinely doing their very best, and are they abandoning all their ideology? I'd love an answer to that question. The way the news is covering it at the moment, for completely understandable reasons, is it's a great national crisis. Let's not bring ask too many difficult questions of the government, because people need to focus on distancing, isolation, and behaving well. But the reality is, if you had cameras in a place like that, you would be able to answer some of those questions that we're all worrying away about at night, when we're sort of thinking, what the fuck is going on with this crisis? So I'd love to be telling that story at the moment.
Yeah, no, I don't know if anyone's pitching. Another question from
Harry
the floor.
Harry Simmons' video diary.
If somebody in the audience is saying, if you're quite inexperienced in documentary making, but you've got an idea for some access and authentic story, but you don't have that track record. What's the best way of trying to get that story commissioned and go into production company, etc., etc.? How's the best way to get that off the ground?
Well, in that case, I would. I mean, you do need it's important. You will have contacts. You'll have more contacts than you think you've got. If you've made anything, there'll be someone that you've worked with who, you can run a story by, run a piece of access by, and they'll give you good advice. Don't be shy about doing that, and don't hold it to yourself. There's no point in having a bit of access you can't do anything with. Talk about it, and someone might have a good idea about how to make it better. The other thing, I think, if you're really genuinely feeling that I don't know where to go with this, then get a bit of it. So, despite what I was saying earlier about making sure you're not filming too much free and without all the kind of thought and agreements that you need in place, if you've built a relationship with a person or a particular small organization, then film, because that is the thing that will allow you to then demonstrate that that either the story is good, or the characters are good, or the space is interesting. So and also, I mean, dinosaurs like me don't know, I might have a sort of reasonably good idea about what's going on in the world, but I don't really know how to capture it. I'm useless on cameras. I couldn't edit for Toffee. Most people I'm working with now in their sort of 20s absolutely can do all of those things, and they can put something together that is truly amazing. So if you're in that lucky category that you can shoot, edit, put stuff together, then you're going to make a really compelling. Hopefully, if it's a really interesting thing, you'll make a really compelling thing that people might then be interested in. But but be wary of not doing too much free.
Yeah, no. There's a question from the floor. Can you explain your start in the industry and what drew you to documentary rather than, say, drama?
So, I was one of those very, very lucky people who got into the BBC without. I was always interested in. I was quite journalistic, and I was really interested in politics. And I rocked up at the BBC without a sort of really clear career plan. When in the BBC in those days, you were able to sort of travel around quite a lot. So basically, everyone did everything for about 2 years. So it allowed you to sort of kind of work through, what you were interested in and find what you weren't interested in. So I was really lucky that this was in a time before indies almost entirely, I think. So really, it was almost as if the BBC worked like a set of indies, like in the way everyone else is now working now. So I did a lot of stuff in current affairs initially. And the thing that I'd always been interested in documentaries, and to a certain extent, I found myself a little bit trapped in current affairs because I was more interested in. For me, the interesting stories were either really quick ones or really long ones. And I was working on Panorama at the time, and I used to dread the thought of being told, could you please go to Bradford and do 6 weeks on education policy. That was the thing I didn't want to do. I would love the thought of doing a year-long investigation on police corruption, or even the government's falling apart, let's do something. So I'd worked out a kind of bit of a niche from doing that. But I had another sort of blinding insight moment for me, was I was actually doing a program about police corruption, where this was back in, when was it? It was early 90s. And me and a colleague decided, bizarrely, before there were even any rules on secret filming, that we had a contact who said he had a corrupt relationship with a policeman. So we thought, well, what's the best way of capturing that for real? Because no one's going to believe us. So eventually, to cut a very long story short, we went to to a secret spy shop in Mayfair and bought some hidden cameras, which we then put into our contact's car when he met the bank cop. And that turned into a year-long police corruption investigation and a really successful Panorama. And was the point which all the guidelines on secret filming were then invented to deal with our stupid behaviour. But the thing that I learned from that was that I was obviously completely obsessed with this story and what it meant. And whenever I was telling my mates in the pub about what was happening, what was doing, why had I disappeared for 6 months, and I said, oh, we're secretly filming in a car park in Kent. They're like, so what, you're there all day? And we're like, yeah, we're hiding in some cars around the back. And they're like, well, how do you piss? What do you eat? And suddenly I thought, that's what people are really interested in. They want to know the story of how we're capturing the story, not the story. And so all my program making from that moment on went into capturing as much of that sort of material and telling the story of the story rather than just the sort of more current affairs way of going, there's some bent policemen and, you know, this is the way they're organised and this is the office they're working out of. And that's what then made me think I'm determined to go into documentaries, and I went into documentaries, and from then I've been incredibly lucky to sort of carry on doing what I love for, you know, quite a few years now.
Brilliant. I'm going to take the last two questions from the floor now. How do you win an argument with a commissioning editor in the edit? How do you get them to see the story the way you do?
Gentle persuasion. I don't know. I've no idea. You know, how do you win the most powerful argument is when something works. I mean, you know, very, very rarely you sit in an edit in a viewing and people just don't have anything to say because it's worked. I mean, the best ever viewing I had was a very bold commissioning editor who came in, watched a cut, and went, you know, I haven't got a single note, and just walked straight out. You know, I've always respected him for that, because it's so easy for people to chat and give notes and fiddle away with stuff that is working. I mean, you know, that is a very, very rare occurrence, but, you know, essentially make it work, make it good, and you're not going to get stupid notes. If it's not working, then you're dealing with lots of very clever people. You know, we're all really clever. Every single person who wants to make programs, to tell stories, is clever. And therefore, they're all going to have their own idea about how to make something even cleverer, even better. So if it's not working, you're going to have 1,000 different ideas for making it better. If it is working, then you'll narrow those down. And then if you're lucky enough, work with the people you like, work with the people you trust, work with people with good instincts. Now, not everyone can guarantee that. And obviously there are some not very clever or not very nice and impressive people that you will bump into in your careers, but generally, just, you know, like in all things in life, gather around the people who you trust and think are good, and then it's much easier, and then you'll win more arguments.
And this last question from the floor: fixed rig has obviously been an amazing turn of the wheel for documentary making. Have you got any ideas what the next leap forward might be?
I wish I did. I'd be on the phone straight away to various different people. No, I mean, I mean, how are we going to structure storytelling when in a more hyper communicated world? How are we going to, you know, are we going to be trying to sort of capture those things in the absolute moment? Is that the way in which people will engage with factual storytelling, or are we going to move more and more to the sort of the considered long-term narrative? You know, I just don't know. I mean, one of the things I've tried to push everyone in police custody to do is to move our storytelling into more of the drama space, to make it feel more like you're watching something where it's only at the end you realise, oh my God, and that was real. So that's where I think we're having a lot of success at the moment, because it so contrasts with everything else that you can do by just going online. You know, it feels different. It feels more like a treat. But, you know, that might end quite soon. I don't know. I mean, there might be a limit to how much you can do that. At the moment, I'm sort of enjoying working in those worlds. But, you know, let's, you know, come to me. Someone tell me this fucking future. I don't know.
Right. This is the very last question, because we have to wrap at 10 past. So people in the audience, if you can just sort of send some thank yous on the chat to Simon, and then I can pass them on. So the last question: if there was one organisation or one institution that you'd like to get into, what would it be?
At the moment,
yeah,
I'd like to understand this crisis internationally. You know, the Trump White House.
The Trump White House. Yeah, no, okay, we're all with you on that. I just want to say a huge thank you to Simon for being one of the first people to offer to do this. And it's been an experiment. I think we've been able to take all your questions. So we got a new format. You know, normally if you sit on the platform at BAFTA, you can't get that, can you? And there's loads and loads and loads of thanks coming in. So we got a new format. You've actually can take all the questions. People have asked if we're recording it. We're recording most of them. We've recorded this one, so we'll put it out there. But you'll get a little evaluation. Do send that, because the more
be kind.
Be kind. But the more you respond, the more we can get money out of people to do more sessions like this. So that's great. So I just want to say huge thank you for joining us. We have 97 people, so that's fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for putting up with the tech. And thanks for giving me a reason to put Lippy on again. So,
and I just say a huge thank you to Donna. I mean, this has been the most inspiring and fantastic initiative she's done. Everyone in the industry is hugely grateful for her. Thank you very much.
Right. Cheers, Simon. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.